Question for you. Do you know what an escape room is? You've ever heard of one of those? This kind of new thing. An escape room is this room that you get locked into, an escape room. You get locked into it, and you got to solve puzzles and got to figure out clues in order to be able to open the door. And people pay to do this. They pay to get locked into a room and solve these puzzles. Now, recently, the city of New York began cracking down on some of these escape rooms. And do you know why the city of New York cracked down on these escape rooms? Well, it turns out that many of them don't have an escape exit. So you go into these rooms and you get locked in and you got to figure out the clues, and you are really locked in. If there was a fire or something and the guy wasn't there on the other side, you'd be stuck. And so New York's like, yeah, it's just for fun. You got to have an escape exit out of these things. Now, it strikes me that the fun of an escape room has to do with what you believe about the future, right? The fun of figuring out that code and trying to figure out the clues and getting out is based in the fact that you believe you will get back out, right? If you don't believe that you're going to be able to get back out of this escape room, then it's just scary, right? That's no fun at all. You don't pay to go into a locked room that you can't get out of. That's just a prison cell. I used to serve in this food pantry, and the food pantry was an old building, and it had a walk-in safe, and we just kept our cans of beans and corn and stuff in the walk-in safe. But I remember on the inside of that safe, which was always open, it had this big sign that said, "You are not locked in," right? In other words, if this thing happens to shut, pull this lever. You are not locked in. Because most of us don't want to get stuck in a locked room. That would not be fun. But with the escape room, it's different. It's fun because you believe you will get back out. And, you might not figure out the puzzles. You might not get the clues. But no harm done. You'll pick your pride up off the floor and go and get a bite to eat. And that's the end of it. It's fun because you believe the future includes you getting out in somewhere. Right? And I think a lot of things are kind of like this. That the way we experience them has to do with what we believe about the future. Right? So we think we're going to be able to get out of this locked room, so it's not scary at all. It can be fun. And I think, if you weren't sure you're going to be able to get out of that locked room, you wouldn't like it at all, right? And I think Easter is a little bit like that. Because this is the day when we celebrate the fact that though the nails pierced Jesus' hands and feet, and though he hung from the hard wood of the cross, and though his side was pierced, and though he was dead and wrapped in linen and spices and laid in a new stone grave, that the story doesn't end there. That Jesus is risen, that he walks out of that grave, that the keys to death and Hades are dangling from his fingers, that Jesus has traveled the sinuous road from death to life, and he has opened life beyond the grave for all who place their hope in him. And I think that says something about our lives now, because what we believe about the future impacts about how we live our lives in the present. Jesus has conquered the grave. Jesus has trampled down death by death, and that gives us hope for the future. That changes everything. We are not locked in. There is more to life than what meets the eyes, and because Jesus was raised, we have hope. Now, this hope was just beginning to dawn on the disciples that first Easter morning. And you know the story. The women showed up at the tomb, and they found that stone rolled away, and they found Jesus' body missing. The grave clothes were there, but the blanket was strangely folded up, as if the person who had removed them had not been in any hurry at all, as if he had all the time in the world, eternity even. The body was gone. This despite what we learn in Matthew's gospel, that there were a couple of soldiers who had been stationed outside of the tomb to prevent any funny business. After all, hadn't this Jesus of Nazareth said something along the lines of that he would raise from the dead after 3 days? Weren't his disciples precisely the kind of people who would try to slip away with the body and declare that Jesus was raised? And so the authorities thought, prudently, better guarantee that this Messiah they had gone to the trouble to convict in a sham trial and put to death by the most humiliating and painful method possible, stay good and dead. But no. The women arrive at the tomb. Women, people whose testimony in that day was given little credibility, and these women discover that the tomb is empty. Though even that changes shortly thereafter because an angel or angels tells them that they have no business looking for the living among the dead. He is risen. Go and tell the disciples. In Mark's gospel, the story breaks there. They don't say anything to anybody because they are startled and puzzled and perplexed and afraid. But the word gets out. Peter and young John come running and they find the same thing. The tomb is empty, but their future is full of something that they had lacked a scant few days before: hope. In fact, if you're looking for proof of the resurrection, this is probably it right here. This ragtag group of defeated and dispirited disciples, 12 pathetic peripatetics, is suddenly turned around and launched out into the world with purpose and conviction and hope. They scattered when Jesus was arrested in the garden, but now they are willing to die for their conviction that Jesus has been raised from the dead. They argued about who was the greatest, but now they are willing to set out to the farthest and least corners of the world to preach the good news that Jesus has been raised. Something happened. And in my opinion, it's hard not to take at face value the claims those first disciples made about their experience. Jesus was raised from the dead, and that changes everything. Now the disciples have hope. It's this hope that the Apostle Paul picks up on in his passage that we heard from 1 Corinthians 15. He says, if only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are to be pitied more than all men. And he's right. If our hope is that everything will turn out all right in this life, that we will not face suffering, that we will not have to confront hardship, it doesn't add up. If that's the case, then how pitiful is our hope? How easily disproved? But Paul says that this hope goes far beyond this life. It's a hope that's grounded in the meaning of the resurrection, which is this: not just that Jesus escaped the bars of death, but that he broke open death. He defeated the power of death and the devil, that his resurrection represents the first fruits of the resurrection. Let me tell you what first fruits are. In the Old Testament, people brought some of their harvest to God as a thank offering, right? So they'd harvest, they'd bring some of the best, some of the first. Those are the first fruits. Bring those to God. And that's what Paul calls Jesus, the first fruits from among the dead. Jesus is the first one, the one whose life was offered for the sins of the world on the cross and who now lives his life as an offering for God. And here's the thing about the first fruits. It implies that there will be more. Christ is the first of those to be raised from the dead, but there will be more. All who place their life in his hands will be raised, will experience the life that extends beyond death. And Paul says that death entered the world through that first Adam, but now through the second Adam, Christ, everlasting life has entered the world. That's our hope for the future. It's just what Jesus said in the Gospel of John. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Jesus said that he will raise up those who believe on the last day. Jesus said that he goes before his people to prepare a place for them. Now, we have to be very careful and think deeply about this point right here, because Jesus' resurrection is not the happy ending to the gospel. Everything turned out all right. The hero is actually alive. A good time was had by all. Something much bigger is afoot, something cosmic. Jesus' resurrection is the great reversal of death. It is death unwinding, death turning inside out so that life prevails. And it all began that first Easter morning when Jesus broke the prison bars of death and rose victorious from the underworld. What this means is that our hope is for life beyond death. It is a future hope. And so often we place our future hope on what we can do, in the plans that we can make. But this hope is about what Jesus can do in his life. It is in our lives. It is a hope in him. It means that we will see all of our loved ones who have placed their trust in him. We'll be with them. We'll get to have those unfinished conversations. We'll get to celebrate all that's happened in the interim. We'll embrace and we'll be together in the presence of God. That's our hope. It means that sickness doesn't win. Cancer doesn't win. Hurt doesn't win. Jesus wins. It means that there is life beyond death. It means that the great wound that lies heavy and jagged on the world will be mended. That's the meaning of Jesus' resurrection. That's our hope. Because Jesus was raised, we have hope. But Jesus' resurrection isn't only a hope for the future. It's also a hope for the here and now. In the Gospel of John, Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. It's the present tense, I am. It means that we should expect his resurrection power to be turning up in our lives right now. There will be green shoots of resurrection pushing up through all the old deadness. There will be sprigs of life. We should expect this. We should expect to experience moments of resurrection where we will look out and say, oh yeah, I see it. I get it. You know, something about the resurrection changes how we live our lives. You see, the hope of the resurrection is not a formless hope. It is a hope that is given shape by the life of Jesus. Jesus carried this resurrection hope inside of him. It was always there. He had predicted his death and resurrection multiple times. He knew his business. He knew that he would die. But so too, Jesus knew that his work would not be complete until he lived again and destroyed the power of death. He counted on it. That was his hope. It was a hope that was really rooted in a deep confidence in the character and faithfulness of God. And that gave Jesus the power and conviction to truly live. I mean, just look at Jesus. Look at his life. Jesus knew how to respond with a wise word in a tricky situation. He loved children, and children loved him. He had compassion on the sick and suffering. He stood up to abusive power. He was filled with love and confidence when everyone around him was filled with fear. Peace, be still. Jesus knew how to pray. Jesus knew how to preach. Jesus knew how to teach. He knew where to go and when to go there, and he did it all with humble panache. Jesus lived a life of consistent holiness, plucky love, and convincing, enduring, steadfast sanity. And in our age of debauchery and unforgiveness and scatterbrained, fleeting distraction, that's how I want to live, like him. I want to live that same kind of life. I want to have that same kind of hope. It's not always easy to get our finger on what it looks like to live resurrection hope in the here and now. I mean, there's a supernatural component to it. It's a hope that comforts us when we face heartache and loss. I don't know how many times I've sat with people in times of loss. And yes, there's always deep heartache. And yes, there is always great sadness. But there's also hope. And there's this peace that passes all understanding. And you cannot force or feign or rush to that hope. But it turns up and it bears people up. It's the hope of the resurrection. You know, the resurrection hope is what empowers us for service. It's resurrection hope that gives us courage. Resurrection hope opens our hearts in compassion. Resurrection hope points us toward the way of peace. And I've seen it. And I recognize it. And I've lived it occasionally. Writer Kent Annan describes a movement among young people of faith who are choosing Christian service in some of the poorest and most difficult places on earth, like the slums of New Delhi, India, or the red light district of Bangkok, Thailand, or the mountains of Haiti. And he calls them the new friars, after the friars of old. Friars were men who took monastic vows of poverty and service to the church. And these so-called new friars are folks who have often grown up in comfortable middle-class families, but felt the call of Christ to journey through the eye of the needle and live and serve in the poorest places on earth. And writes Annan, moving to a slum, taking on discomfort and risk, living with rats, this is one way to live hope in Christ's resurrection. It's hope in Christ's resurrection that sends us beyond ourselves and gives us the courage to live and be present and act when we get there. It's hope in Christ's resurrection that defines our whole earthly life. Hope in the resurrection shifts all of our priorities. We'll start to ask, what does it mean to live the good life? We'll ask, if Christ was really raised, what will I choose for my career? What will matter most to me? And not all of us will end up in the slums of New Delhi, but even so, resurrection hope grasps us. When we really take that hope to heart, it changes how we live because it changes how we think of death. Neurosurgeon Paul Kalanithi, he died a couple of years ago. But before Dr. Kalanithi died, he wrote a book called When Breath Becomes Air, exploring his own experience of dying. And he wrote this: "The way forward would seem obvious if only I knew how many months or years I had left. Tell me 3 months, I'll spend that time with family. Tell me 1 year, I'd write a book. Give me 10 years, I'd get back to treating disease. The truth that you live one day at a time didn't help. What was I supposed to do with that day?" What Dr. Kalanithi realized is that faced with the universality of death, all of us seek meaning for our lives. What are we supposed to do with the one day before us? We seek some accomplishment, some relationship, some identity that will define our lives. How much time do I have left? If we knew, perhaps we could try to do or accomplish something that would redeem the rest of our life. But one day, what do we do with one day? But that's just it. We're all living that one day. There's nothing that we can do that will redeem our lives, our years, our days, not completely. No matter what we do or who we become, our days on earth are like grass, like wildflowers. We bloom and die. The wind blows and we are gone as though we had never been there. All the things that define us, those load-bearing walls of our lives, our work, our family, our commitments, our allegiances, none of these things will ultimately prove sturdy enough to sustain hope. And this is where I think resurrection hope comes in. In Jesus who was raised, we discover a way to think about how we will live that one day. We realize that all we ever have is one day, this day, to live. And this isn't an answer to life's greatest questions, not exactly. But what it is a way to approach life, a way to live in this day that we've been given. The tomb was empty. Christ was raised. And so now we have hope for the future and a hope that gushes into our present reality. What does the resurrection mean for our lives? What does it mean for your life? How do you respond to Christ's empty tomb? Well, in many ways, I think it's quite simple. Live in resurrection hope. Amen.